If you're looking for an independent perspective on Call of Duty World War II from a fan who's played every game since the original Modern Warfare, then this is the review for you. This review will focus mainly on the multiplayer in some detail, but I will touch on both the campaign and zombies too. For the first time in 9 years, Call of Duty has returned to World War II, the setting which helped kickstart the franchise back in 2003. It's not just the setting that's familiar with this title either. Sledgehammer have made good on its promise of returning the series to its roots from a gameplay standpoint too. This can be seen as both a blessing and a curse, of course. If you're a fan who's been following the series for a long time and have been waiting for a return to the reality-based, grounded gameplay of the original games, then World War II might just be what you're after. If innovative new gameplay and fresh ideas is what you were hoping for, then you might be disappointed with how familiar 2017's Call of Duty feels. To say that World War II isn't innovative would be unfair though. Sledgehammer have had a good crack at pushing the series forward, but at its core, this is still a very typical Call of Duty game that includes everything that you've come to expect from the 14-year-old franchise. Just like with the past few entries, the game is split into 3 distinct parts: the campaign, competitive multiplayer, and zombies. It's a decent amount of content. There's been some controversy around how many multiplayer maps have been included at launch, but compared to many other first-person shooters, there's a lot to sink your teeth into. Even if you're not interested in everything that's on offer, it's likely that you'll be happy with at least 1 or 2 areas of the game. There's a real sense that Sledgehammer have tried to deliver the definitive World War II experience, and although there have been more bugs than usual for a Call of Duty launch, World War II certainly still shines from a presentation and content point of view. World War II is easily the best looking and sounding Call of Duty game so far. From the excellent sound design, to the lighting effects, to the overall attention to detail, it's clear that returning to a historical setting was the right move as far as the presentation is concerned. There's a surprising amount of colour for an era that's usually soaked in sepia and khaki. It's never garish though, and it's been used sparingly to give the game a realistic and time-appropriate appearance. For the first time in a long time, there aren't any out-of-place weapon camos or character skins that have been so prevalent in the last few games. Sledgehammer has promised to keep these items thematically appropriate down the line too, so I wouldn't be holding your breath for any animated weapon camos or gingerbread outfits. The sound design in particular is worth mentioning, as it does an excellent job at creating both a chaotic and believable war zone. At the same time, it remains functional, providing a crisp distinction between background noise and the necessary audio cues to let you know what's going on. Oh, and yes, sound whoring in the multiplayer is definitely a thing again. Environments are another strong point, being well designed and providing a good blend of well executed map design with locations that feel like real places. Weapons have seen an equal amount of attention. They look, sound and feel menacing, with many having their own distinct traits and personalities. From the M1 Garand's classic ping, to the way incendiary rounds cause enemies to scream and roll around, there are plenty of small details in World War II that will make you smile. This level of detail extends to the point streaks in the multiplayer too. This helps familiar streaks such as the glide bomb, which could easily be compared to the Predator missile from earlier games, feel fresh and rewarding to use. Like with every Call of Duty on console, it runs at a solid 60 frames per second, and apart from the aforementioned bugs, the experience is otherwise as smooth as you'd expect. For anyone who's spent the last few years wondering what a modern take on World War II and a first-person shooter would look like, you're in for a treat. That's not to say everything is perfect though. There are plenty of historical inaccuracies that, depending on your point of view, could ruin your sense of immersion. There's also a few NPCs that clearly sidestep the QA process when it came to facial animations. The user interface also feels out of place. With its clean lines and minimal appearance, it looks like it was ripped out of a much more modern shooter. The UI is also pretty confusing with so many options and submenus. Customizing your loadout in between games, for example, is much more complicated and time-consuming than it should be. On top of this, there are quite a few legibility issues in the headquarters area, where there's a large amount of information and icons fighting for attention. With so much going on, it can be difficult, if not impossible, to find what you're after. Now, these are not game-breaking issues by any stretch of the imagination, and hopefully they'll be addressed in a future update. More than any other Call of Duty in recent memory, World War II multiplayer places a big emphasis on making weapons feel unique and fun to use. Shotguns are loud and powerful, SMGs rip through enemies up close, and sniper rifles make a satisfying crack as they land devastating shots from across the map. The number of attachment options for each weapon makes experimentation both enjoyable and important, because, at least at launch, many of the options seem viable. Character customization returns and provides plenty of options for creating a unique avatar. As I mentioned earlier, some of these options aren't historically accurate. Female soldiers undoubtedly will make some parts of the player base unhappy, but having said that, there isn't anything that doesn't fit the time period. Divisions are this year's version of the Creator class or Pick 10 system. There are 5 divisions, each with their own weapons to focus on and special abilities. Division training are passive abilities that work much like perks. The Infantry Division, for example, has one which allows you to equip additional attachments to both your primary and secondary weapons. Division skills are an active ability, such as the Airborne Division's Silencer that can be equipped on all SMGs by default, while the Mountaineer, which is the Sniper class, can use an aim assist. Basic training are much more like traditional perks from the previous games, and these are available to all divisions. These offer abilities like being able to move more silently or reroll care packages. Divisions are a good idea and add a nice layer of context to the options in your loadout. It can also make creating a specific class a bit more straightforward for players new to Call of Duty. In the past, if you wanted to build a loadout for stealth for example, it was up to you to know which combination of perks, weapons and attachments worked well together. Now you'd simply pick the Airborne Division and half the work is done because all the best options are grouped together. Again, the UI doesn't do a great job of making everything clear, and with so many submenus and options it can be a little overwhelming. It's a shame because it's clear that Divisions was an attempt at simplifying the Creator class system while still providing a similar level of control, and it might have succeeded if the execution of the UI had been more on point. Point streaks aren't particularly original, but the way in which they're executed makes each one feel rewarding and elevates an otherwise well-trodden feature into something that feels exciting again. The fighter pilot, for example, is over very quickly, but it can pack a lot of punch for the small amount of points required to earn it. It looks great too as it flies overhead and adds a nice layer of spectacle to each match. Point streaks can be earned in the traditional way by getting a streak of kills and points in one life. If you use the Requisitions basic training though, you can continue to accumulate points even after dying, much like the persistence trait from Infinite Warfare. Point streaks cost more this way, but it can be a good alternative for players who would otherwise never earn the high streaks. Movement is one of the main areas in which World War II has returned to the series' roots. As promised, it's an old school boots on the ground Call of Duty with no physics-defying movement mechanics. Maps have been designed with the movement mechanics in mind, and they are far less vertical and labyrinth-like than some of the more recent games. This definitely results in less unavoidable deaths from players that you weren't aware of. Matches move slightly less quickly as a result, although to say they feel slow would be an understatement. An average game of Team Deathmatch is still between 5 and 6 minutes long. Because there are less potential paths you can take, traversing the map is much more dependent on strategy. Parkouring off 3 separate walls, double jumping through a window and knee sliding behind an enemy to take them out may have worked in Infinite Warfare, but certainly not in World War II. Movement is far less dependent on dexterity and speed, and much more reliant on map knowledge, situational awareness and communicating with your team. It's a gameplay style that feels familiar and comfortable, and as a fan of the older games, it's a welcome return to what made the original games fun. Outside of matches, Sledgehammer's attempt to innovate is much more obvious. Gorn is the standard lobby layout we've been used to for over 10 years. Headquarters is definitely the standout here. It acts as a social hub where you can spend time on a variety of activities while hanging out with other players in between matches. Well, in theory you can hang out with other players. In the week since launch it has been locked down to solo play only while they sort out the issues. Outside of interacting with other players, there's still plenty to do though. You can buy contracts that earn you XP, test your skill at the firing range, take part in 1v1 matches, prestige and even practice using the point streaks. Also, in one of the many ways that the game exposes you to supply drops, you can open them in front of other players. In fact, the game even goes as far as rewarding you for doing so, but more on that in a minute. Headquarters is a good idea in theory. The problem is that you have to physically navigate your character to an activity's location to start it. To make matters worse, it's presented in third person and will occasionally jump back to first person for certain activities. It's a strange and jarring experience and it ultimately ends up feeling like a chore to use. Undoubtedly this has been made worse by the large amount of issues the mode has suffered from at launch, and while it's likely that they'll be fixed at some point, hopefully Sledgehammer has improvements planned for this component in the future.
I'm sorry, General. Looks like rain for the next few days.
The other significant area of innovation in the multiplayer is with the new war mode. This is an objective-based game mode, a little bit like Battlefield's Rush, only the objectives are more varied and the maps aren't nearly as big. It certainly feels different to any mode in Call of Duty that has come before, and adds some much needed variety to the multiplayer. It's definitely not for those who are looking to preserve their KD because of how frequently you die, but if you like objective modes where team coordination is important, this is definitely a nice addition. Okay, so let's talk supply drops. This is easily one of the biggest areas of concern, and for good reason. Call of Duty has had a rocky road when it comes to their implementation. Supply drops are constantly being showcased throughout the multiplayer in World War II, and it's not just your own that you're exposed to. On top of seeing them opened in headquarters, at the end of each match there's a screen dedicated to showing the top players and who's earned new supply drops. At launch, supply drop content is a little underwhelming, but given how frequently they're promoted, it seems likely that at some stage they'll contain more attractive items. Sledgehammer introduced supply drops back in Advanced Warfare. Since then, weapons and other items that have an impact on player performance have been included in them. Sledgehammer promises that this time supply drop content will remain cosmetic and that there are no stat-based variants in play, but whether or not this extends beyond the launch window remains to be seen. Overall, the multiplayer provides some of the best grounded Call of Duty gameplay in years. It's too early to say if there are balance issues, but so far it's fun. It's not going to be for everyone, particularly if you prefer the titles with advanced movement, but if the older games are your preference, this is definitely worth looking into. I'll admit I normally head straight for the multiplayer, and it was no different with this game. That being said, the opportunity to play a modern Call of Duty set in World War II definitely caught my attention. The campaign is a little on the short side for players hoping for something a bit more meaty. At roughly 6 hours it's on par with the previous games, which is more than enough for those simply looking for a distraction from the multiplayer. If it's the main reason for purchasing the game though, you might be disappointed with its brevity. From a gameplay point of view, it will feel very familiar to anyone who's played a Call of Duty campaign in the last 10 years. This may or may not be your cup of tea, just don't expect anything radically different. To summarise, it's very linear, there are lots of quick time events, and it's still centred around you being a super soldier capable of killing hordes of bad guys. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad though, it just leans more towards a summer blockbuster rather than a thoughtful look at one of the darkest times in human history. From a storytelling point of view, it's definitely one of the more cohesive campaigns in a long time. Maybe this is because the source material is so well trodden. It's not a new tale or a particularly interesting one if I'm honest, but it's enjoyable to play through and pretty to look at, and it's definitely worthwhile for fans of games set in World War II.
Luck with that. Oh! Briefing's at 1800, we're gonna be late.
In the same way that the campaign usually doesn't interest me, zombies has never really been for me. Having said that, the darker take on the zombies component and the fact that key members of Sledgehammer's development team were involved in the Dead Space games certainly piqued my interest in the mode for the first time in years. This also feels like a return to the series' roots. Zombies has always been a bit nuts, but the interpretation of this mode in the more recent games has been a far cry from the original Nazi zombies in World at War. Make no mistake though, Nazi Zombies is still nuts, but it feels much closer to Treyarch's original vision and once again manages to feel creepy. There's plenty of options to play this mode too, so if online isn't your thing, you can go solo or buddy up with a friend on the couch in split screen.
That sounds like flies buzzing, but it's too cold for flies.
From an outsider's perspective, it's easy to say that World War II is simply the same game we've been getting for years. But the reality is that we haven't had a Call of Duty game like this since 2013, or arguably even earlier. As a long-term fan of the series, there's a lot I like about Call of Duty World War II. Sure, it definitely has some issues, and arguably World War II wasn't the most interesting era to visit, but 2017's Call of Duty is one of the best games in the series for a long time.